I thought I'd be innovative by not using a PowerPoint presentation. Not that I've got anything against Microsoft or any of the very innovative IT sectors, but I thought there's always something nice to engage with the audience through the power of direct speech. And I really like to focus on three main areas. One, which is the key challenges facing the industry, just to set the scene, because Novartis painted a good picture this morning, and I would like to take that perhaps to a more holistic level. And then talk a little bit about innovation and different models that we're having a look at. And there's been some quite interesting developments, literally in the last 6 months, that I'd like to draw attention to. And then step perhaps a little bit bravely into how we might suggest we might enhance international cooperation. It's something that advocacy organizations don't often do. We normally tell governments what we'd like the substance to be, and we allow them to work on those mechanisms. But I can give you some insights from a personal perspective on how we might work together better going forward, and then draw our thoughts to a conclusion. And hopefully it won't be too long. So starting off then with the key challenges facing the industry, well, pretty much what we're finding is that innovation is getting harder. The serendipitous medicine of one size fits all has become very difficult for us to identify, and has become very, very costly. And the second big challenge is that as patients, we are rightly demanding more safer and effective medicines. It used to be years ago that if you got sick and you took a medicine, you would accept that, okay, this medicine is probably going to do some bad, but hopefully the good will outweigh the bad. And as time has gone on, that has become more socially unacceptable, and we're really trying nowadays to limit those side effects that we often experience when we take our medicines. And that's reflected in the regulatory approval process for medicines. The interesting thing is that many experts have said that aspirin, in the UK we said an aspirin a day keeps the doctor away, would not be granted regulatory approval these days because of the side effects. So again, something that we might take fairly frequently, the stringent requirements that we have today, it might not actually get regulatory approval for stomach bleeding and so on. And just to pick another area that was spoken about earlier, in the area of Alzheimer's disease, there has been over 100 clinical trial failures in that area, and we're still not finding a cure for that disease. And Baxter was the latest failure, unfortunately, on that area just in May of this year. So again, it just shows you that it's becoming a little bit more challenging to actually find the medicines, and even if we do find them, there is nervousness about making sure that they are absolutely as safe and effective as they can be. And then the third challenge for our industry, and it's no secret, is that we are facing a patent cliff. It really is a patent cliff where profits are disappearing from one day to the next. And the economic downturn is putting a lot of pressure on the health budgets of many, many countries. And I think that Forbes has called it the decade of drug company job losses. And I think that's a reflection of how that we are trying to become a lot more streamlined. We mentioned marketing earlier. A lot of the jobs have been lost from marketing, but unfortunately, increasingly, that's also having an effect in R&D. But predominantly, it's the poor salespeople who are facing those losses. And just to give you some figures on that, in 2010, we lost about 60,000 jobs, and that was the highest private sector job loss globally, followed swiftly by retail and telecommunications. So then, those are the kind of challenges that the industry is trying to grapple with. And then when we think about innovation, what are we up against? And I very much liked Francis Gurry's talk, I think it was at the first symposium, where he talked about microbes. And this is who we're fighting. They're a fraction of our size, but they have a very low cost base. They're incredibly innovative. They use manufacturing facilities without any prior informed consent. And you know what? They don't respect any national borders. They don't need permit Bs. And so even the Swiss are not safe from microbes. And I think the interesting thing here is that we're not only talking about microbes, but NCDs. We all know that the big challenge of NCDs is coming. Perhaps we are told we can take more control, and I think that's very true. We can eat healthier foods. We can stop smoking if we smoke. We can prevent excessive drinking and take more exercise and so on. And I think here, this is where we start thinking about innovation that goes beyond treatment. I really love the Canadian example of the prescription to get active. So if you go to your doctor and you may be a little bit like me, a little bit cuddly around the edges, they say, well, we'll give you a prescription to go to your local gym, and it will be free for you to do that. And I think that is a fascinating way of trying to offset potential health challenges that come along later on. Prevention, as we always say, is always better than the cure. And I think that is a very innovative way of making somebody maybe go to the gym because it's free, but then once they get there, the releasing of endorphins, they get into it, that might actually be a sustainable activity going forward. And I think we do need to think about innovation as a broad concept, not only in prevention, but in diagnostics and in treatment. And I think I know this, the Secretariat's tried to get people from the health technologies industry here, but I think when we have a symposium like this in the future, their contribution and their innovation will be absolutely vital. Something that struck me just a couple of days ago when I was reading the BBC web pages is that there's a young man called Jack Andraker from the United States. Has anybody heard of him? Any hands going up? No? Well, he's only 16 years old, and his uncle and one of his best friends died of pancreatic cancer. And he said, well, why is it that we have to wait until the symptoms show before we can identify that they have this cancer? Surely there must be a better way of identifying this problem, because as you know, with pancreatic cancer, once the symptoms show, it's often too late, and 85% of people at that stage will pass away. So what did he do? Well, he was a very clever young man, no doubt, and he worked up an idea for isolating a protein in the form of a biomarker that would actually address this issue. He wrote to 200 universities. Bearing in mind he is 16 years old, and there was one university that said, you know what, this could be quite interesting. And that was the Johns Hopkins University from the United States. And now, after working on that area, he has created the first simple, effective, cost-effective biomarker for those diseases, and it's about 90 to 95% effective. And I think that's a very powerful thing when we think about innovation. It's not just the generation who are working in the labs, it's the younger generation. They're not just the future, they're very much the now. And I think when we think about innovation, we really do need to think creatively about what innovation really means and who should get involved. And I think that's quite an inspirational thing for us to think about it at the age of 16. I don't know what I was doing at 16, but it certainly wasn't anything useful. But there are people out there who are innovating for the furtherance of global health. Now, I do have the most tremendous respect for people who do work in R&D. They're often forgotten. We close them in laboratories and we let them work away, and hopefully they produce something. I had the advantage of going to a research facility just yesterday, actually, and actually seeing how these brave men and women work in these areas. And I mean, my background, before I did policy, I was an engineer. And on graduating, I went to work for a Japanese company, and then after 2 months realized that I didn't want to be stuck next to a production line, and therefore maybe this wasn't the future for me. So I went and joined government, which was out of the frying pan into the fire in some ways. But you start to realize that things that look very fascinating and interesting on first glance, if you're doing it for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and it's the same laboratory, that can be quite stifling, quite difficult to comprehend. And I did ask the head of R&D, how often do people move from one R&D cell to the other? And he said, well, we built up our expertise. We become the leaders of the field. Why would you throw that away by going into somewhere else? And I just think that mindset is a fascinating mindset, that these people dedicated day in, day out, working in an area, in the same area, potentially for their whole careers, but yet there is a chance that they will produce no medicine that is marketed for the benefit of patients. And and that's actually not an unusual thing to actually for researchers to actually come across. And I think that is a very compelling reason why supporting academia and our scientists within the companies is so important. And I did say to him, do you ever get concerned about the number of failures? And his view is that if we're not failing, we're not trying. And I think that is another interesting dimension that we also need to remember. As part of the human experience, we always have to fail before we normally succeed. And those failures we just need to minimize them and make sure that they don't become the modus operandi. But that is really something that I think we need to remember. We've talked a little bit about how innovation is getting harder today. I mean, we're spending more money than we've ever done before. We spent about $45 billion in 2001, and last year we spent in excess of $120 billion from Evaluate Pharma, according to them. And one of our CEO, who is president of IFPMA from Eli Lilly, said that we are taking too long to produce too little and spending too much money. So we have started to see, for very sound business reasons, but also for societal reasons, how that we are changing the entire business model of the industry. Just to give you one figure, BMS last year had a phase 3 failure and wrote off $1.7 billion. You can't sustain a company if you're losing that amount of money. And that's more than the health budget of many African countries. So what is the future? Is it all black and is it all dark? Well, I think cures for a broad range of diseases in the same class are becoming rare. But as our understanding of the human body, the pathways of how disease operates, the Human Genome Project is a fantastic example. We are starting to develop treatments that are much more targeted and are much more sophisticated in how they operate with the human body. And it's not just simply killing off the microbe or treating the condition. It could be to prevent spreading or reproduction. It could be to protect vulnerable areas, or indeed to make sure that the body's immune response is in some way enhanced. So on this front, many believe that biotherapeutics offers a very exciting area for drug development. And I think that's probably very, very true. But it is true as well that this is a much more complex area of development. And I think what we're seeing is that there's a greater desire among the companies to share the risks, of course, and share the resources, but then also to share the rewards. And that's something that is the new model that we're seeing, is the moving away from profit alone models to profit together models. Now that'll take a little bit of time for you to see coming down the pipe, because the medicines that are launched today, development started about 10, 15 years ago, but that's something that really is going to be interesting when we see medicines being launched in the next 10 years, not being owned necessarily by one entity. The other thing that is quite interesting is moving away into non-traditional actors. The ITU launched in the ECOSOC just a couple of days ago, mHealth. Mobile technology has a great potential for addressing some huge health problems, one being patient adherence, and the figures lost, the medicine value is lost through patient adherence is quite staggering. But if you do have a mobile phone, and many of us around the world have mobile phones, if you have a little beep signal which reminds you to take your medicine, very simple but very powerful at reminding you when you need to take your dosage. And it's something that we all have a problem with, we all forget, irrespective of where we might live. And I think the other thing that I find interesting, because I used to work on this many years ago in engineering, is finite element analysis, which is to virtualize how a clinical trial can take place. And that's simply using mathematical models to predict how the human body will react to certain chemicals, to certain biologics. We've done it in cars. We build cars, we crash them into walls, and we see how the car deforms. Will the passengers survive or not? And that's all done on the computer even before you try out costly crash in real life, in real time. And it's starting to happen. It's happening now. It's happening in eye treatment, and we expect that area to grow over the next 10, 15 years. Another exciting development that probably just to touch upon before moving on to international cooperation is Transcelerate, where 10 companies came together and said, well, how do we together work on the big health challenges, drug development challenges that we're all facing. We're all facing these challenges. We're all making the same mistakes. How can we make sure that we learn from each other? And Transcelerate was really set up to think about how we can do that across the board, particularly, though, in relation to clinical trials. It started off with 10 companies just last year. This year it's now got 16 companies. It'll be very interesting to see how that new initiative develops going forward. Another very interesting area that's quite recent, that is a new model, perhaps for our industry, is pay for service. And some of you may know, in the area of antimicrobial resistance, the US government has actually paid GlaxoSmithKline $200 million for the development of antibiotic-resistant treatments and to fight against potential bioterrorism that may occur in that space. But again, this is a fascinating model. It's working with BARDA, which is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Agency, part of the HHS in the United States. But again, that's a different model. It's saying, this is the product I want, I'm going to pay you for it. And it very much reminds me of more the defense industry model, where you might say, well, I want something that's unique. I want, like something from the air, the new state-of-the-art fighter jet. Now, you know that it's probably going to cost you 3-4 times your budget. You know it's probably going to be 5-10 years late. But the advantages of that, of sharing the risk and investment, is that you know that you will have huge control over the end product. And whatever you want to do with it, be you a government or whatever, you have that power and you have that license, so to speak. So again, it's a very interesting model that we may see happening where there are clear gaps, or where there's a clear need that a government identifies and says, we want company A, we want you to develop it. The only downside really is in the pharmaceutical space is that the risk of failure is slightly higher, or maybe significantly higher. You know you're going to get a fighter jet out at the end of the day. It may not have the performance characteristics you want, but you know you'll get one. In the area of medicines, you may actually not get the medicine that you pay for. But again, I think balancing the risk and reward is an important part of that process as we go forward. PDPs are growing in many areas. Our industry has rapidly expanded its involvement with PDPs over the last 5 years. It's 3 times as much as before. And again, a fascinating model because it allows us to benefit from sharing of different expertise, different backgrounds, different pieces of information, giving our unique perspectives and inputs into the broader collective. And I know that an African proverb says that if we go it alone, we go fast, but if we go together, we go far. And I think if there's anything about drug development, it's in for the long haul. We have to be thinking about going far, and we can't necessarily always rely on short-term wins. Another model is prizes, and that has been mentioned. I think these could work well in areas where there's already a platform of work to build upon. And certainly we don't think that there's any harm in trying prize approach where there's clear gaps in R&D. We know there are problems, and Anthony mentioned some of them earlier, but let's try not to be too frightened of failure, and let's try new things. One other area is the medicines patent pool. I think, under Greg Perry's leadership, I think we are trying as our industry, as IFPMA, to connect the dots. And wherever we can facilitate contact, we will absolutely do that. Now, moving out of my comfort zone into the area of international cooperation, well, what do we think? Well, it's always interesting coming later on in the day because many people have said very intelligent things, and there's always a risk of repetition. But I think generally speaking, the IGWG process and the WHO has really helped galvanize interest and understanding about this area of innovation in the area of health. And I think we agree with many that, first of all, we do need to identify systematically and standardize global review of unmet needs and R&D gaps. I think we need to know where the problems are and the extent of the problems before we can then start to think about prioritization. And something that is often a challenge is methodologies. Is what methodologies do we use? Because sometimes these methodologies complement each other, sometimes they don't, and actually they can give you very different outcomes. Having a standard methodology, if the international community could develop such a thing, that would help us to be able to identify exactly how to deploy this methodology and actually understand how it works in practice, then we could start to create a very powerful landscape of how success might look like, where are we being successful, and where are we not being so successful, and how can we learn from those failures as we try to go forward. And again, I think, again, these kind of things sound very simple. They can be very difficult in practice, but sharing best practice and learning from failure is something that perhaps we need to do a little bit better. And then I think bringing this all together, I think we hope that the WHO Observatory will provide a platform for achieving these goals. It seems to be the sensible place for us, and as we've heard, there are many, many different items of work going on out there. There's the G-Finder report, there's Richard Lang's work. I think there's a solid platform on which to build upon, but we need to have somebody who is willing to coordinate and bring all this together. And I think it's eminently sensible that the WHO takes that role to facilitate coordination. And I think here we're not necessarily talking about leadership, because these different bodies have different government structures, but there has to be somebody who has the full picture on health, someone who has the landscape to be able to identify who is working in which area, how successful are they. Because when we start talking about finances, and Margaret mentioned this morning that we're not going to necessarily find new areas of financing, but we have to use existing resources better. So we need to identify where duplication of efforts is taking place, remove it, and where are the gaps where we can maximize our collective input. Something else that we would like the international community to think about is conducting research on what environments really help innovation to thrive. What are the things that governments can put in place if they want to build a domestic biotech industry or a domestic industry in healthcare technologies? That's something that we think could be very, very useful in helping those countries identify from empirical studies and case studies about how they could achieve that. We've been trying to do that in our industry. We've had some research commissioned in that space, because we believe there's a strong correlation between what we need as global pharma and what domestic industry is looking for when we're talking about innovation. And I think it's the final area that maybe is useful to mention is the importance of regulatory capacity and strengthening that, and enabling convergence. Now, we try to move away from harmonization, because, as was mentioned, it's always great as long as you come to me rather than me go to you. Whereas I think the idea of convergence means that, yes, we're all going to have different perspectives, different ways of thinking, but as long as we can converge on the main issues, the main points, then that actually saves a huge amount of money and a huge amount of time. And, for example, the International Conference on Harmonization is actually doing this job as we speak, looking at finding areas of convergence and building capacity. And they're really there to try to identify unified approaches that countries can adopt for new therapies, new medicines. So we're not continually reinventing the wheel, or when we're submitting dossiers, we're not having to do huge amounts of different work. And of course, all of this work is underpinned by the 3 pillars of quality, safety, and efficacy. And just last week, actually, in their conference meeting in Brussels, some important countries have now joined that steering committee, if you like, the highest governance body of the ICH, and that includes Brazil, India, Russia, and China. And regional groupings all the way from PANDRA in Latin America to SADC in Africa to the Middle East to ASEAN in the Far East are all now actively participating in ICH. And I think that's a fascinating development, but we don't necessarily hear so much talked about the work that's happening there, and maybe that could help us when we start talking about this conundrum of regulatory harmonization and the balance between safety and efficacy that Margaret spoke about this morning. And I think finally it's important for us to see the 3 organizations coming together. Countries, I think, need to strengthen their ability to have greater coherence between innovation, economic and health policy, because as many studies show, there's a strong correlation between economic development and what we're looking for in terms of global health. And I think it's clear that these things are sometimes long-term, but people are not always prepared to wait, and quite rightly so. So we need to make sure that we're not focused too much on the future, but at the same time that we're not focused too much on the here and the now. I mean, managing expectations in this area is not always easy, and I think it does mean that we have to have a sustained commitment for success. And in conclusion, I think it's important to underpin that 10 years ago, the NGO community rightly brought the world's focus on public health. I think as an industry, we've learned a great deal from the mistakes of the past, and I think we need to continue to learn, and we need to be continually open to challenge. It's always important for us to identify that we certainly don't have all the answers, and as a big industry, change is always difficult, but we have to change, and we look to you to help us with that change. And then I think when we think about how we go forward, how we continue to innovate, we realize that we have to collaborate in order to pool resources and to use our specific unique attributes and expertise when we try to fight the ever-growing threat posed, whether it be from microbes or the growing burden from NCDs. And I think it's true that we have to also think innovatively about ensuring that patients all around the world receive the latest treatments that we can provide together, irrespective of where they live. And I think it may mean that we need to learn a little bit more about how we can make this partnership work. It's always sometimes difficult to work really closely together, depending on what your history might be or what your perspective is. But I think challenge, open rebuke, as the proverb says, is always better than secret love. I know that not many people love us, but the proverb still stands. But I think that together we can solve the health challenges that we face. And I think in that regard it's important to acknowledge success. And maybe we don't acknowledge success as much, because I think acknowledging of success and acknowledging of change helps those change agents within companies really help drive that forward. And I think there's nothing wrong with celebrating success. So in conclusion, I think 10 years ago fingers were rightly pointing at each other. But I think going forward, there's certainly a realization from our industry that we have to go hand in hand. Thanks, Tony.